Welcome! This video is the third in a series called Market Access for Digital Entrepreneurs, brought to you by SEDA, the Small Enterprise Development Agency, with support from the European Union. In this series, we have assembled a range of entrepreneurs, industry experts, and subject specialists to share their insights and experience from different angles about commercializing startup digital products and services. These videos are first and foremost for entrepreneurs, but we hope they will also be of interest to incubator and hub managers and business advisors. In this webinar, we will take a look at the role of women in the gaming industry in South Africa. To tap into this market locally and internationally, you need to understand it, where the opportunities are, and how to take advantage of them, as your success is determined by your understanding of the market, your product's competitiveness, and the effectiveness of your sales methodology. It's a high-growth sector with rapidly growing use cases, so it's fair to say it's game on. Let's begin.
Welcome to the Women in Gaming webinar, which is jointly hosted by the Small Enterprises Development Agency, SEDA, and the European Union funded program Ecosystem for Development of a Small Enterprise, EDSE.
I'm going to give you a short story of how excited I am to see this. In 2011, I was in Taiwan. A presentation from a Japan game designer was asked a question on how does Japan keep developing games and technologies that their neighboring countries are failing to copy. And the answer there was simple. They said, we use our deep cultural knowledge in system and languages to make sure that our game start first speak to the local people who's going to be the first buyers. Then the external people then, because they are so inquisitive to understand why Japan is so glued up into these games, into these technologies, they then begin to learn and participate in their gaming system. But the context was that using your culture or your local content culture as a context and also as a bargaining tool to create those games that other people then would like to understand how one get promoted into this game to the first phase, the second phase, the third phase, the fourth phase, whatever you name it. So I think this is long overdue. Thank you to our partners, the European Union, for opening up this opportunity and to invite our women, because in Africa, we know that there are so many games that women in general, we learn from them, talking about stone games that we know that they normally do it well. We talk about the jumping games where they jump and swing the rope, and then you jump around. There's a particular pattern in which we have to jump around. If you fail, you hold the rope and so on and so on. But there are so many other games that they've been played in Africa that now they are ready to be commercialized and to be put into the commercial space, where they can then be utilized for market access. Now that they've mastered the games, they know how many phases this game is comprised of, and how one needs the skill to be skillful in order to be promoted up to the last level, if I may say so, or to get the highest points. So it is high time for this now to happen, and I'm glad that as we've passed the Women's Month, we are also continuing by promoting women businesses and women own businesses access to market in order for them to promote these wonderful games. We are really impressed with the level in which this could expand, as we know that we are now going to a coding elements. Most of our young girls are now studying coding and programming and so on and so on. So this is a great opportunity for these young girls to know that this program is not just for programming's sake, but it is for commercial purposes. And I would like to say thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Martin, who is the leader of the EDSE team for this wonderful opportunity. And all the panelists, and thank you for your time. And we look forward to hear your experiences on how then we can set the tone of developing the African Games, but focusing on women.
As a South African based in Cape Town, who started off with someone who grew up playing games, loved all of the many different aspects that go into game making, like storytelling and art and game design. All of those things have contributed to a career now where I've spent 10 years in the gaming industry. And it's been one of those things where it's always difficult for many of us to be the front runners, to be the first to go into the gaming industry when everyone doubts whether or not that's even a real career. To be a woman in that industry is adding to that challenge. So very, very happy to share some of my experience and what's worked and what hasn't, and the struggles and the opportunities that we can all find together. So essentially, if you do consider yourself a gamer, someone who has the gaming hobby, then you might be someone who's playing all sorts of games and are really passionate about that. But there might be some of you as well who don't necessarily identify as a gamer, but are actually playing so many games in your life. If you decide that going into games is something that you want to have as more than a hobby, and you want to have that be something that you can make money from and build a career from, then the first thing I would say to you is there are so many great resources that can show you behind the scenes making of games, because there is not just one type of person who makes games. There are so many different fields that contribute to it. So maybe the programming is something that is the obvious one to look at, but there are also artists and animators and storytellers and everyone who's also contributing towards making these games. So maybe you have other skills or other interests that you can see, okay, well, if you want to make games, what would your role be in making games? Maybe you're not even a traditionally creative person. And we know we all use creativity as in our roles, but we also need people who are good at the business side of games, from the production management side of games. There's basically a role for all of these different skill sets. So the more you can learn about how games are made, then you can start to envision a role for yourself within that industry. And even if that shifts and changes over time, it's always good to start off with that intention. For those of you who are unfamiliar, serious games are a subset of game design where we design games that have a serious purpose other than pure entertainment. So those games can be games for education, or games to communicate an idea, or games to promote something, or to assess a skill. And there's so many different ways, but essentially this is what Sea Monster has built their business over the last 10 years. So we've done all sorts of interesting things where we have got games that help promote an understanding of how to keep yourself safe from HIV, for instance. We're currently working on a game where we are trying to create understanding around the COVID-19 vaccine and why that's so important. We are also looking at how we can use games to help people understand themselves. So for instance, Many of you might have done one of these personality tests where you get asked a whole bunch of boring questions and you have to say, oh, I'm more like this or less like this. What we've also done is replace that whole system with a game that's like an interactive space adventure that asks you to make decisions based on the story. But in the background, we're actually assessing your personality type in the background. And then that is based off of one of our large consulting firm, PwC's, aptitude assessment tests, and those results are then equivalent. So now it's something that people are much more engaged about, and it's actually solving a business problem that people have. And it's the businesses that have the large access to funding in this country. So what is really important is if you can look at what people are doing and see what problems are there and how can games solve those particular problems. So that's just one way I'd love to inspire everyone to think about what can games do, what can you achieve through your skills, and take it from there. There's so many different ones. So if I can take it all the way from our production pipeline, we have people who seek those opportunities for business and games to connect. So these would be your business development producers and managers who essentially have a great understanding of business and a great understanding of gaming. And they do the job of matchmaking to go, okay, you need this type of solution. I know the team that can make it. And it's crucially important because without those people who understand both sides of the fence, no game developers in that particular context would get the work. So it's really important. You need to be good with people. You need to have a real good passion about games and an ability to communicate the value of games to people who might be skeptic or not understand what games are. So that's one. Then producers and production managers, they're the ones who keep everything running on time. So they have a deep understanding of the processes involved in a game, and they do the job of using different types of production management methodologies to make sure that games ship on time. We know this is the one department that catches the most hate when a game is released too early or delayed indefinitely or runs over budget or crunch time. So it's such an important skill, and if you can be a good game project manager, then there definitely would be a space for you. Then the other side is from the story development and copywriting side of things. So often games, if your game tells a good, compelling story, then it's another way that people get really sucked into the game and really want to keep playing it. Then there's also sound designers who imagine the sound of the world, who compose the music for it. And there is a lot of specialization there where if you are making music for games, that it's not the same as just writing songs. So that's something that you could definitely go into. And then of course there are different types of 3D animators and 2D animators, but I suppose that's more on the obvious art side. But there are lots of specializations in there, and definitely you can, even if you aren't necessarily an artist, you could become a great technical artist in developing interesting particle systems or cool VR effects, things like that. So many options that I really encourage everyone to investigate them all. The reality is, in this particular country, that the best thing that you can do is actually show up with having done some work already in your own time. And I know it's difficult if you're trying to also study or do another job that supports you on the side, but if you can show up with a sketchbook full of character designs or a prototype, even if it's not a programming prototype, but of a card game that you designed with your own rules, just something to show that you're not showing up on the door just because you like games and you think that playing games is fun and therefore working for a gaming company will be fun. It's a hard job. You're going to work really hard. So that really helps to show people that you are serious about it. And As soon as people see, some evidence that you've done the work, that you've been involved, that you've researched the company, that definitely gives you such an advantage. This is an interesting one because it depends who makes that game for you. I would definitely recommend that no one raises money for a game without some sort of prototype, because sometimes you might have an idea for a game and it sounds fun in your head, but until you have something that people can actually play, you just don't know. So what I would suggest is that before even hiring a team or outsourcing it, you would either yourself learn the basic skills to prototype a game, and there are lots of tools like Game Maker and such that can at least help you get that feeling and refine it and test it before you start spending money on other people. And then only once you've got something that you feel is quite sticky, then you look at the funding for creating something that is more broadly scaled. Then it depends also who you get to do your game development for you. I mean, from Sea Monster's point of view, we've created games from like 400,000 Rand is a cheap game, all the way to millions, depending on what you want that game to do. So put that in the back of your mind, but you can prototype a game very, very cheaply and simply. And it doesn't need graphics, it doesn't need any of those things. If your game is engaging without all of those bells and whistles, then we can start talking. And the main feeling is wanting to create that feeling of being welcome in a space. Because, I've been there, I'm sure many of us have been there, where you go in there and that feeling of, it's quite intimidating, where it's like you feel like you don't belong in a space, and therefore something that is difficult and scary for everyone is now even more so. So my suggestion would be, if you don't feel like you fit in, don't worry about it. Like, you don't necessarily, you can carve your own path. And just because you don't fit the mold doesn't mean you don't have value. And I would say you even have more value because you've got a different perspective that other people don't have. So when I played tons of different games when I was a kid, but through the course of my studies and going to university and so, I hadn't played serious online games in years. Like, I didn't have a console in my house anymore. My PC was terrible. They had terrible specs. And then people go like, you want to be a game designer, but you're not even like a proper gamer. So just like ignore everyone who says that you don't fit whatever their expectations are of you. Because you've got your own perspective and you've got your own thing to say. So value that, even if other people don't, and just keep pushing and you'll eventually get there. I would say always have a view in mind that this game needs to be sold. If that's what you're not doing it for a hobby, because sometimes you can make a game and you don't expect to make money from it, and that's fine, and that's a great learning experience. But presuming you do, I think it's really important to think about what is your plan? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you should start doing that before doing anything. You should definitely have a game in mind and start working on refining that. But you need to know how you're going to get it out there, because earlier on this sort of, the question is, how much does it cost to develop a game? I'd say like you need even more money than that to get that game out there. And even if it is trying to find a publisher or just going through the channels, and what if you fail? Like, you need to have a plan in place to go, okay, what if? Because it is, it does take a lot. So definitely think about it as a business, think of it all the way through. But also, I feel like some people get like discouraged by the immensity of that problem, so then they don't do anything. So I would definitely say, if you want to be a game designer, learn to prototype games and make games, and as many games as possible. But if you want to get paid to make games, or you want to make money off games, that's maybe like the second phase of your career. or try and find, that's what I mean, we've made games for marketing campaigns, for education. So many people are doing online schooling now, make educational games. Like, there are so many ways that you can learn to make sticky games before you have to take out a massive loan to make it happen. I always try and be the voice of the player at the end of the day. So even when I'm speaking to a client or someone who's paying for the game to be made, at the end of the day, whatever product that they want to produce won't succeed unless people want to play it. So me as a creative director, I want to make games that people want to play, and the same things that appeal to me would appeal to the player. And it's like you've got to check yourself and make sure that you're not just adding pretty art but for pretty art's sake, or like because it's your vision. Like, no, you have to check yourself in terms of where you're spending your client's budget. But at the end of the day, that's your role, and that's where your creativity needs to come in. Is yes, there is the business constraints. Yes, they want to, like, they have particular objectives, but because you are representing the player who's going to, at the end of the day, either enjoy an experience or not, that always needs to come first. Otherwise, people just won't engage with the product and it will fail.
Before we start talking about the opportunities in South Africa specifically, though, I want to do a little bit of a dive in looking at what the global opportunity is, to give us context on what the ecosystem in the market in South Africa is in comparison, so we know really kind of what we're talking about. So the games as entertainment industry was valued at about, or is valued at about $175 billion this year. Which makes it the third largest entertainment industry in the world. The games industry is worth more, and this is a fairly common quote if you do any sort of research on it, but it is worth more than film and music combined. So it's on a global scale, it is absolutely massive. What's important then is that, well, where does South Africa and where does Africa fit into this context? You know, how much of that 175 billion does our markets account for? And unfortunately, there isn't actually very much data. It's one of the difficulties that we have, and one of the problems that we face as game developers on the continent is that there's been very little research into what the actual consumer market is. But we have had some people do some studies, and while the data is questionable, it does give us something to build off. So in South Africa, for example, the consumer market is valued at around $371 million. So if you put that in terms of the global context, it's 0.2%. And I just want to kind of raise this in comparison to something that was mentioned earlier on, is Japan was raised as kind of an example of maybe something that we should be following. And Japan specifically makes use of its domestic market. So Japan, by comparison, has a consumer market worth $13 billion. Japan alone accounts for 7.5% of the global spend. And I think one of the key takeaways that we need to learn from this, and some of the experience that we've said, is that if games as entertainment is what you are intending to pursue, I would very much caution against looking at the local market. There are many structural and other issues in place where to say that is not a viable business strategy at the moment. Where we have seen a lot of success, and where I would encourage most developers, especially if you're going into the games and entertainment space, is to look at producing African content for a global audience. Games distribution pipeline has moved increasingly online. We don't have to deal with the issues of sort of global shipping and global logistics to get your product out to a global market. And there is a demand there for the games that we are making. So why limit yourself to a global market that is of so little value? You also will butt up against consumer preferences. That $371 million, that is the value of the local consumer market, is nearly always spent on AAA, so these are kind of like your big blockbuster games, both mobile and on console. And from the data that we've been able to extract from local developers, less than 100,000 Rand is spent on locally produced games. So while there is a market opportunity here, as a strategy, I would encourage you to be focusing on getting to a global audience, which is actually relatively easy to do thanks to the online distribution platforms that are available and are most common for people. So have a global mind when you are developing your games, because you're going to be able to reach far larger audience. You're going to be more likely to be able to engage with the community and players who will actually engage and pay over trying to just limit yourself to a very, very small market that you will have great difficulty monetizing. But before we kind of go on now, I want to talk about the three predominant business models, I suppose, in game development, because each of them have unique opportunities, and each of them there's different ways that you need to approach them. There's different ways to consider how you're going to do it. And there are different opportunities within Africa and South Africa for those different business models. So basically there's the producing your own game. So this is, I'm going to make my own game and sell it on the Google Play Store or on Steam or on Xbox or PlayStation. And you will earn your income by making the sales of those games. Next, you have what Jade was talking about and what Jade's company does, Sea Monster Serious or Impact Games. And these are games where you have entertainment is not the primary value. And often that will be driven by a more traditional B2B basis. It's also very important to note that in Africa specifically, there is a lot of grant and NGO funding for these sort of games. There are a lot of societal and environmental issues that external agencies, global agencies want to try and solve, and they often see gaming as a way of doing it, or using games to kind of deal with those issues. And so if you do want to focus on a local market, Impact or Serious Games holds much better potential than just pure entertainment games. And I mean, Jade spoke quite comprehensively on what that kind of means, so I'm not going to delve into that too much more. But then lastly, there's services, which is something that has become certainly the largest studios in the games for entertainment space in South Africa are playing in that. And that's basically outsourced employment. So you do work for foreign studios, either in specific skill sets. So if you have a lot of animators, for example, when there's a large studio based in Cape Town that does animation and rigging and in-game movies, essentially for some of the largest games produced in the world. Or you can do, if you have a high degree of technical programmers, you can assist in programming, outsourcing development, porting, which is when you basically make a game work on a different platform. So the game may originally be developed to work on, say, PC. Then you can hire a porting company to then basically recode the game to make it work on an Xbox or on mobile or on a PlayStation. And South Africa has a very interesting value proposition in this regard. One of the big things that works for us is that we're in a similar time zone to Europe, where there are a lot of video game studios. And so working with that international market becomes really easy because we don't have to worry, say, with working with the United States, for example, which is, you get these really odd kind of clanky hours. So Europe is a very good market for us for our services. But the other big thing is that while we're not the cheapest, we offer very good value for money. Something that South Africa has managed to do over the years in the services sector specifically is being able to prove that while we might not be as cheap as, say, software developers or software engineers or animators in Taiwan or in India or even Poland, we can often offer a better experience or provide better work than those engineers could do. And there's been a number of studios who've been able to build a very successful business by fulfilling those needs. So if we look at kind of the global market and those kind of things, so those are kind of the three predominant kind of business models, and each of them pose different opportunities. Most of them are looking global. You want to try and tap into that global audience, which is something that almost anybody can do, say, thanks to the nature of what the work is. But if you do have a very specific focus on looking at the domestic market, then I said serious and impact games is probably going to be the one that's going to be the most viable. But also even services there is proving to be an interesting proposition, especially with more and more tangential industries. So things like architectural visualization, for example, and sort of what Jade was alluding to is that like your banks, architectural firms, even the film industry, a lot of these industries are now starting to use game engines and games tools. And so if you can demonstrate proficiency with those tools, you can help them build that product. And there's potentially quite a nice business model to be exploited there. I want to talk a little bit about mobile specifically. I want to kind of shift the focus back to games for entertainment, which I know one of the following speakers is going to speak quite extensively on. But I think it's important to understand what the domestic market looks like, where the opportunities should exist to the degree that they do, and also try and deal with some of the misconceptions that a lot of people have around that space and around that market in South Africa, and why we advise that maybe focusing on the local market isn't necessarily the best way to do that. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but if you were to look at the average gamer in South Africa, or if you were to look at that $371 million US, where is it actually being spent? And it's predominantly being spent on mobile. So the largest category of gamer or people playing games or people playing their games on their mobile. And that makes sense. We have a high number of mobile devices. People like to be entertained. And these games, because of their business model, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, is that they are free to play. So you can just download the game. And that allows you to kind of get your experience. So there's no barriers to entry. It doesn't matter if you don't have a credit card or if you don't have access to money, you can very readily get entertainment on your phone. And if you looked at in comparison to, for example, something like a PC or one of the many consoles like a PlayStation or an Xbox, those are very expensive luxury items that the majority of the population can't necessarily afford. And so that limits your potential market quite drastically. So let's look at mobile. Yes, there are more mobile players in South Africa than anybody else. And yes, they account for the largest proportion of game players and value generators. They are the biggest income stream. But now it's very important to understand how these games make money. In mobile, there are predominantly two major strategies. One is use what we call free to play using in-app purchases. So this is you download the game for free, and then the game will then prompt you to make purchases inside the game, either to get in-game currency. So typically this will be something like in Candy Crush, for example, you would buy gems or something, which then allow you to get extra lives so you can continue playing. If you have what is called an idle game, you may be familiar with those. Those are games where your actions are kind of on a cooldown timer. So you can do something, but then you have to wait a certain number of time, an hour, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, 2 hours, sometimes even a day before you can do that action again to progress in the game. Often these sort of games will use in-app purchases as a way of removing that time gate. And so you can say, well, no, I don't want to wait a day. I want to do it now. So you can buy some money. You can purchase some in-game currency and then basically make that time gate go away. Now, that is probably the most popular business model globally. But it hasn't really worked in South Africa or Africa actually as a whole. And it accounts for why our consumer market is reflectively so small. And it's a big part down to that classic problem that a large majority of our population are unbanked and don't have access to credit cards. Now, what is interesting is that if you look at somewhere like Nigeria or Kenya, where they have mobile money like M-Pesa, which has been integrated into their informal economies very successfully, something that hasn't necessarily happened in South Africa just yet. But they've managed to get their mobile money to be integrated into these gaming platforms. So people can spend M-Pesa or use M-Pesa to buy their in-app purchases. And as a result, you see that those two countries tend to have better consumer spend for these type of projects. And so there's an easier audience to monetize in those two countries specifically. The other popular model is using advertising. So you've probably seen this as well. You'll play a game or you'll have an app and you are served ads that come onto that platform. And that's essentially how you're monetized, right? Is that the number of people who see that ad, you will earn a fraction of a cent for every person that sees it. And hopefully what should be quite clear from this though is that in order for a mobile game to be commercially viable and to be monetized successfully, you need a vast number of users. It's very much a user game. It's about how many hundreds of thousands, millions of people can you get downloading your game in order to start even generating some sort of revenue. And this is where we face a really big problem in South Africa, is that type of game and that type of studio requires a massive amount of investment. I was recently looking at the statistics around this. So in order to get the cost, in mobile, there's something called user acquisition costs. So it's how much money do you as a business need to spend on advertising, marketing, and kind of your other expenses to get one person to download your game and then convert them to a paying person. Because remember, the game is free to play, right? And for African audiences, and this is Africa and Middle East, so the data is slightly skewed, but we're one of the cheapest in the world. It costs around $50 to get one person to be a paying customer. Now, if you need to get hundreds of thousands of those people, you're looking at many millions of US dollars in an upfront investment to acquire those users and convert them to paying individuals before you start earning any revenue. And that is why mobile generally has been very, very difficult for local developers to tap into, because we are competing with these massive global companies who have the budgets to do that user acquisition, and they're just beating us to the post. Back to advertising, though, slightly different. The problem that we're facing there is that how that works is that there's basically an auction for advertisers. So someone will say your game what will work through a back-end service will say is, I have a user in South Africa. What your game will then do is it sends a message essentially to this advertising auction house, and it says, there's a slot here to advertise to the South African user. How much are you prepared to pay to advertise to them? And now, obviously, the more people that are interested in doing that, the bigger your prices. Africa as a whole, and South Africa is no different to that, has a very underdeveloped advertising marketplace. And what I mean by that is that there are not enough people willing to spend money marketing to African consumers through these channels to make it viable. So whereas, for example, if you were marketing to a user based in Japan or in France or in America, you could earn maybe 50 US cents for that ad because someone's prepared to pay that price. If you compare that to South Africa, your South African consumer at least, you're going to be paid a fraction of a cent because there's just not the demand there. And so now you've got this other issue where if you're relying on advertising, which is what the majority of African game developers do for their mobile games, they're just not getting the numbers. And even if they are targeting a large local audience, because their advertising spend isn't valuable enough, they're not getting it. But this is where a very interesting lesson from Nigeria comes again, which again speaks to why we should be maybe looking at an international audience for your games, regardless of what you're doing. Nigeria is valued as the largest games economy on the continent. South Africa is second. And a big part of their success is not only the mobile money, but also they're targeting their expatriate or the diaspora, Nigerians not living in Nigeria. And that significantly raises the value of their ad spending. So, and then you've kind of got these people who have left Nigeria, perhaps it was their parents, their grandparents, and they're wanting to reconnect. So it does show the value of this cultural proposition, but they're not making their money from the Nigerian consumer market itself. They're making it from elsewhere. And I think a very similar tactic needs to be followed in South Africa. I then also kind of want to talk that. So, I mean, that's kind of thing is be very careful if you are targeting the local audience, if you are going to be doing games as entertainment. People have tried in the past and they have struggled significantly because there are these structural issues in place. And quite frankly, the consumer market isn't quite ready for it yet. Jade was talking about getting that prototype funding and how it is difficult, and it still is. But one of the things that there is an opportunity here is that if you can get a team to develop a compelling prototype, especially if you're a woman-led studio based in Africa, there are now more opportunities than ever because you have dedicated funds looking to support your businesses. So that is also a very interesting proposition and something that we should be looking to tap into. But I will say again that these funds will be looking for you to exploit an international audience. So make African games for a global audience is kind of the thing that I want to reiterate over and over and over again. And then lastly, I just want to talk about the services sector again. So if you look at the local businesses that are playing in the services sector, they are the ones that tend to have the highest number of employment, and they tend to be more long-lived because it is a de-risked environment. There is a good opportunity for people to also start off in the services sector by doing work for hire for other studios, and it could even be domestic studios. Increasingly, we're seeing smaller studios working with the larger, more established studios in the country to get the experience that they need, being work for hire, gaining the experience, and then they're able to leverage that to then start their own IP. And they can show that they've got a history of being able to work on successful titles or just kind of any titles after that. And I would encourage people, if you are interested in getting into games development, either as in games for entertainment or in the impact or services impact sector, serious games, to look at services as potentially an entry point. It is a fairly de-risked way of you, because essentially you just work for hire then, right? So providing you can get a contract, you can demonstrate your skill, you can start getting exposed to the ecosystem, to the network, how things work, how things are done in a relatively safe environment without having to raise a significant amount of capital to actually develop the game before you're seeing any revenue. And then once you've got that experience, you can then pivot to making your own IP if that's really what you want to do. I think there's a very big opportunity for us to make use of co-production. If you look at the treaties and the structures that are in place, games, there's a big opportunity for local studios, smaller studios, to start working with larger international studios under a co-production methodology, which means that basically, so you could work with, say, a German or a French studio, and they will help you build your game. And you'll both get credit for it. So you're kind of working together. It's a very similar model to what we see in film, for example. If you're familiar with the local film industry, there's a lot of co-productions happen here where they come to South Africa and they shoot on the set. They use a lot of our actors, a lot of our VFX and After Effects and stunt people. And even South Africans start having some increasing control in terms of directing and maybe even script development. But then they're attached to a much larger organization who's more well-known, who's able to get access to the funding to kind of enable that. And I think that holds huge potential for us. I know that there are, especially from Europe, there's a great interest in increasing co-production for South Africa, and well, not South Africa, but Africa in general, and working with local game development studios. So again, another big opportunity there, potentially for people to kind of exploit without having to go completely alone into a very high-risk industry. And I think I have a tendency to ramble, so I've probably burnt my hours, or my minutes rather. How do we want to do the questions? Can I just kind of read them from the chat and kind of go on? Or
I think we pass a little bit about the time. We have, time for 1 to 2 questions.
Okay.
But if you want to conclude something.
Okay. I'll leave it as that. It's just, I think my biggest thing that I can say is, again, I'm just going to say it again, make African games for an international audience. Don't focus exclusively on the local consumer market or even the African consumer market. It's not ready yet. If, though, you don't want to be in games per se, and you want to get into game technology more generally, and you want to develop payment gateways, for example, that will facilitate that, that's a very interesting discussion to have, but not really my area of expertise.
That's great. So Thank you, Nick. It was really interesting panel, and well, from my perspective, I'm from Brazil. I'm studying Brazil, and there is a lot of similarities in these emerging markets. Especially, we have the struggles being in a place that it's far from the most important game industry events and funds. But in the end of the day, this value for money from producing a game in South Africa, same as in Brazil, it's an advantage point for us. So $1 in US and $1 in Germany, it's worth less than $1 spent here making games. So it's really important, the thing that you are addressing.
If you can solve that, you've solved probably the biggest issue facing the domestic games industry. Okay, I think there's two bits there, and I think it's really important to decouple growing a production industry side of things and growing a consumer market. Growing more developers, and I think this is a role that incubators can have. So this is businesses playing in the game space. They're not that different from your normal tech startups. So a lot of your other sort of usual advice still applies to them. Something that I've seen, and I think more work could be done, is there's definitely a lack of business skills in game development. We are still predominantly dominated by founders who are first and foremost artists. And I think Martin said something earlier on about don't make the game you want to make the game that the market wants to make. And that's definitely something that we're not having with. So it's not common in South Africa. People are very much making passion projects. They're making the games that they want to make because they're artists and they have artistic integrity. But they're not building viable businesses from that. So where I think incubators can help certainly is saying, well, when you're deciding on a project, what are you doing to decide if this is even viable and it is worth your time, and how you're doing that, and teach people how to do market studies. Like, this is how you examine the data. This is how you go and look at what other people are doing and whether you can find, make the decision on whether there is actually a market for this game that you're proposing. I think that is a hugely beneficial skill that incubators can play a very important role in. Being able to enable access to funding is a big issue. Domestically, there is very little opportunity here, but globally, there is. And I think the other important thing is to say is that you would be surprised at how easy it is to get money from these international audiences, especially because they're looking for it. The international publishers want African studios. They want to sign them.
So when we talk about the skill set, what I like to think about is assume you're not making a two-person studio, because the skills needed for a micro studio, which is a studio for less than 10 people, is just, can you program and do you understand the game development software, and can you make that game? And preferably having an artist, and between the two of you understanding how to keep yourself on schedule, on time, and the budget. Like, that's what you'll need essentially if you're a two-person studio. If you're a much bigger studio though, then the requirements of running that studio become very important. So the first thing that I think is vital if you want to create and maintain a games as entertainment studio is organizational skills. You need to be very, very good at understanding and learning how long things take to make, how much that's going to cost you, and whether or not it's worth it. It's understanding that you have this idea and goal and you can see the game in your mind, but also having that level of pragmatic realism to understand what is and isn't possible based on the resources you have, be that money, be that manpower, be that just the level of experience of your team. You have to always be aware of that, because if you're not, it's very easy to run out of money. You spent 3 years working on something and now that game's never going to come out and you're on the hook for the money. We don't want to be in that position. Another thing that I think is also vitally important is you have to have a very strong management team. What I'm going to be referring to as your lead. So you're going to have your programming lead, your art, it's like your technical director, your art director, your producer, and your creative director, right? You need people who have experience, but who also understand the weirdness of game making and are people who are good at growing those underneath them and have great communication skills. I have seen this industry lose many a woman or person of color or just people to bad management. Because if you don't manage your team properly, they can't grow properly, which means they don't believe in themselves, which means they burn out, which means there's a high likelihood they're going to leave the industry, and we don't want that. And then finally, I think it's very important to understand your game, your audience, and the market. So you need to know, like, the most important thing is knowing how to market your game. And it's also obviously making a great game, but just assume I'm giving you advice because I assume the games you guys want to make are going to be incredible. And then I said money, because you need hardware, you need computers, you need like pads for your artists to write on, iPads and teaks. Shit is expensive. You need software. You need to understand how the software works. You need to understand how Unity works. You need to understand which engine you want to make your game in. You need to have money to pay for those legally, to pay for Blender and all the art programs that people are going to need. Be prepared for spending a fuck ton of money, excuse my language, on sound design. Like, that can also get quite pricey. And to be honest, you also need just a little bit of good timing and some luck. Like, a lot of studios that have done well have also worked very hard and been prepared, but we're also just lucky. Like, sometimes you could have the greatest game in the world with the perfect team and all the money, and the game might not sell. And that doesn't mean you're a failure or you don't know what you're doing. It's just like, games can be hectic. It is a very risky business to go in. And finally, just work on your management skills and have fun. I think for me, what's important, especially within the South African market, is saying you can make your dream art beautiful game, but make sure you have people around you who know how to sell your game to the correct publishers, know which publishers you're aiming for, get people around you who know how to sell your idea to people and get them excited for it, but also be willing to compromise, because sometimes it's not going to be the game you want, but it's going to be 80% or 90% the game you want. And that's okay too. Go on the journey, work hard. Do not crunch. Do not overextend yourself. Take care of yourselves. Have a great day. One of the biggest things I learned is that I just had to immerse myself in game development. I hate this word, but I had to involve myself in game development discourse. You need to be reading what's happening in the industry and keeping your eyes on any opportunities. There are a lot of Black game developer funds that happened in the middle of last year post George Floyd, but a lot of that won't go to South African or African companies because they're looking for established people, right? It's also about knowing who to look for. I think in the sense where you're not sure where to get money and you don't want to take out a massive private loan, or like some of us, you can't. Like, sometimes you just don't have the credit for it, or you have to, you've got to pay black tax to take care of your family. It's okay. You could decide to work for a bigger studio, work for an international studio for a few years, save up, use that money, get skills, upskill yourself on a AAA studio or international studio's dime, and then take that savings, experience, and people you've met, and then push it into making prototypes. You could also look for grant funding. I know, depending on where you are, that is a possibility, and it's something that I really hope the South African government will get behind if they want to grow the industry, especially if they want to grow it in a transformed manner. Sometimes it's also just like doing public funding, Patreon, Kickstarter, Fund a Buddy, Indiegogo. All of those things are also valuable and have the possibility of giving you funding if you don't want to use your own money and if you're concerned about putting yourself in a deep financial hole. Luckily, making a prototype is significantly cheaper, especially if you are strategic on what you decide to spend money and time on and who you get to help you. And if you can get like a pretty strong prototype or a strong, what we call vertical slice, which could be like one level is just game design, no art, one level with the art in, one level with the sound in, you know, just being smart to show all the pieces of what you're making can also significantly cut down the costs and make it easier to sell. In this sense, research will be invaluable to you. If you really want to cut down the costs, research. Ask people, get involved in the local and international communities, go to events, speak to people, be cute. I don't know. Take the time, learn why your game failed, learn from the mistakes or just the process. Even if you don't make a mistake, sometimes you can make a perfect game and it doesn't succeed. But try and learn from that experience, take that experience, and then try again. I think, especially if it's going to be your first time game, maybe aim for something a little bit smaller. That always helps. And be prepared that if your game doesn't financially do well, you'll never see any money from it. Like, all that money will go to the publisher until they're paid off, and that might never happen. Right. But yeah, just you have to pick yourself up. You have to keep trying. You have to keep striving. I mean, I'm someone who's loved video games for as long as I can remember, and I've been in this industry for 5 years. And a big part of that was just kind of sticking it out and doing the work even when it was exhausting and it didn't pay well. And I really struggled and I had no idea how I was going to make it happen. I think you just have to be able to push hard and also be able to accept that maybe your full-time job might not be game development at first, but if you can get yourself to a point where it is, then I think also thinking about what Nick said in terms of being willing to grow your company to do some level of service work, because South Africa is very beautifully placed to do that for particularly European countries, you know? So I think always be open to that and be open to client work and be strategic in how you use the money you get from clients to go into making your own IP if that's what you want to do with the studio you work for.
I think one of the challenges that is out there is the fact that gaming is still so very fairly new. It has been there, but it had fallen in the in the challenge of it being a creative industries are always seen as leisure, as it's just you're just playing games kind of thing, without people necessarily realizing and seeing that it can be. Sorry about that. Without people realizing and seeing that it can be turned out into a serious career. And then as a result, you have business incubators that come in. And by the very nature of business incubation, we are set up to help entrepreneurs that have ideas and that want to take those ideas to market, bring them to life. And gaming, animation, virtual reality are some of the things that we as the AB4 have decided to focus on. We're an enterprise that is focusing on IT across, but with a particular focus on these three: gaming, animation, and virtual reality. And why? Because of the very things that the likes of Nick and everybody else have been saying. There is so much opportunity in that space, but it has not been realized. There's such great opportunities, but not a lot of women are involved. So what do we do about it? How do we work around ourselves to try and encourage and get more women involved? Are there enough Black women? No, not even enough women before we even get to the fact of it being Black or white. You know, the creative industry is still struggling in South Africa. And Nick, thank you very much. I see you have given us a few of the links that we can follow up on, and we're excited about that. We're servicing previously disadvantaged communities, and these are communities that for you and me, we take it for granted that we're talking a PC that people can create games on, or a smartphone. Some of the kids that we're dealing with have not even interacted with a computer before. I mean, a typical gaming computer is expensive. So the likes of AB4R that are situated in the communities, therefore set up facilities, that kids are able to come through and interact with them. So currently what we have in our facilities is literally there's a gaming area that they can come and play and interact with the different consoles, and we have a session where they can make use of the computer, and we have a maker space. But like every other organization and our entrepreneurs, we're still struggling with prototype money. Dimpo made mention of that. How do we get more people understanding, supporting? I mean, even when I was at the Innovation Hub, we had a committee which I thought was such a brilliant idea. It was internal, it was a small grant, and if I remember well, Nyamakop did get that funding. But we were also working with TIA, who would give us up to an amount of 650 at the time, and it was intended on getting prototype. You do an MVP with MLab, and then we take it to the next level and created a prototype. But each time we sat and presented an entrepreneur that was in the gaming sector, oh my God, it was just too painful, because the questions were, why a game? And we had to remind people that, remember, we created a gaming incubator. So as a result, we need to do this. And it's still amazing that there is a whole lot of people that do not understand the market, that don't understand the benefits, that don't even, they're still asking, why should we fund a game? Obviously, there's a whole lot of benefits for creating games. I mean, we're talking, what is the word? For kids, for sensory, for the English has escaped me now. It'll come back. But we had to literally defend ourselves so much that it was not funny. Going back again to the fact of creative industries just being seen as something that is leisurely done and not a space where one can have a career. And where we come in is we are educating, we're getting people to unlearn. We're roping in parents, we teaching the kids how to code, how to develop games. If we are going to empower the disadvantaged, which includes women, funding is a huge part. To develop a prototype is a lot of money. So how are we coming forth to meet them halfway to get them to the next level? We need to get more women. For me, it's not just about Black women. We need to get more women participating. We need to put South Africa out there. There is great potential. We need more animation and gaming studios that people will be able to come through and develop their games. And as AB4I, we are availing ourselves really to partner up and just make sure that more people are able to get the resources that they need to get to the next level. So, yeah.
Well, that's really, really great. We can see your passion on everything you're talking on. It's definitely, you are passionate about it. And it's really exciting to see how many talented people we have into the industry, and the importance of diversity in a creative industry. So how many diverse people we have in our industry best for the products and the results of our ecosystem. And I want to address, of course, you can make questions out there, but I want to address a little bit about the incubation and the difficulty on help and support a very interdisciplinary industry that comes from programming to art and sound and all kind of business skills. So how to support these very different levels of game development in an industry that has its own business models and specific questions and trends and challenges?
Well, working with partners, one of the things that we really try not to do is to be everything to everyone. We are opening up the doors. Okay, you need access to resources and how to get to the next level. We are here. So hence I'm saying we're focusing primarily on gaming, animation, and VR, because those are pretty much linked up.
Prototype funding seems to be one of the major leading funding potentials where studios or devs or any startups could be helped into. But on the contrary, what we're actually looking for and finding a little bit of it here and there is actually pre-to-type funding. And so what pre-to-type funding really means is that you have entities that are willing to give out some money to basically help to help other entities to start out thinking what could look like in a while. And so you don't necessarily need to have a prototype, but you can have ideas, different small ideas that you can test quickly and fail quickly if you need to. What I mean by pre-to-type was products, how prototypes are basically a build. You have a build in your hands and then you try to sell that build after testing it on the ground and see how much further it has went in the market. But a pre-to-type is a kind of creating, when you don't have the product itself, you create and sell the idea first. And so, yes, pre-to-type, thanks, Nicole. You sell the idea first, and based on the comeback or based on the reactions that you have from that idea, then you start selling and then you start producing actually first. And so that's basically what happens in the product design world mainly. But now I'm bringing it to the gaming world because we need to understand and pay attention to how local communities work. Then you gain pre-to-type funding. I call it pre-to-type funding. And then you test out different ideas in very small scale. And when they fail, you can quickly move on to a different idea, right? And so how you can actually gain access to these kinds of fundings is basically by aligning with cultural institutes, for example. They are super supportive as far as I'm concerned. With my experience, a gateway to allowing you to explore different methods of art. And so since in some areas, if you have convinced people that games is also art, then there are people who are willing to open up their doors to let you to experiment, right? And so this is where the pre-to-type funding comes in. And necessarily, like in the African continent, like, of course, all of you do know, it's not just the funding that's actually a big challenge. It's the acquiring permissions, for example, to be, let's say, for example, on the road, right? On the streets to create awareness or so on. And so when you are being supported by different cultural institutes and entities, then you have these smaller barriers broken down at least. So this is where it's super, super important to pre-to-type the game market. Yeah.
Women struggle. So women have been segregated in different sectors. There are male-dominated sectors and there are female-dominated sectors. And this would traditionally be seen as a male-dominated sector. So these strong and wonderful women who spoke on this webinar are women who have just pushed back boundaries and said, I'm going to take up my space. And that's exactly what we heard from Jade. Don't be small, take up your space, go in there. Eventually, they will see that you have the skills, you have the knowledge, you have the technical ability, and they will stop undermining you when you come up with good ideas and learn on the job so that you can go out and start your own business later, get the skills, learn how the business works, and take it up. And there's wonderful opportunities for funding because there are a lot of funders who want to fund women and Black-owned businesses. So you're sitting in a pretty position to set up partnerships and start co-producing with other people who might have different skills to you that you can bring into your business, get funding and take this forward. Pedro, thank you so much for your wonderful facilitation. It was really great to have somebody with so much breadth of knowledge in this sector to be able to engage with all of the speakers and understand the questions. And then, of course, the panelists, Jade and Nick and Dimpo, Helabugile, Bethlehem. Wonderful, wonderful talks. Absolutely great. I hope I haven't left anyone out. SEDA, of course, Mongani, thank you for coming along, and Rulani with all the work you did in the background. And then on the EDSE side, our teams, the township team and the enterprise supplier development team, headed by Martin, fantastic work that they're doing. But it really is important to give a very special mention to Daniel, who has managed this entire platform and the technology without a glitch. And it would be remiss to not thank Wendy for all the hard work. All of you, I'm sure, have engaged with her and are very aware of all the hard work that she's done. So thank you, Wendy, for putting together a wonderful show like this. It was great. So thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to let me give a summary.